Today's conference is called Today's Terrorism, and I'm surprised. I'm going to deviate from my script for 1 second here. No one, to my knowledge, has mentioned that today New York City opened One World Trade Center for business. A clear blue sky day today, and the first office workers are there 13 years on. I just think it's worth mentioning. As Karen said, I'm a journalist and a fellow here, and I wanted to start this presentation with a story. You're driving south on the FDR Drive toward the Brooklyn Bridge. You see signs for the Ari Halberstam Memorial Ramp. You ask yourself, who is Ari Halberstam? To find out the answer, you need to turn the clock back 20 years, maybe 25 years. On November 5th, 1990, here in New York, an Arab militant named El Sayed Nosair shot and killed Meir Kahan, known as a right-wing Israeli politician and provocateur who believed all Arabs should be expelled from Israel. Kahan was so radical, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, had expelled him. But Kahan had a lot of followers. Among them, who swore revenge for his death, was Baruch Goldstein, a Brooklyn-born Jew who became a doctor, emigrated to Israel, and moved into one of those controversial Jewish settlements in the Arab-dominated West Bank. On a Friday, February 25th, 1994, in the West Bank city of Hebron, Goldstein, armed with an Israeli-made military assault rifle similar to an AK-47, opened fire at the Tomb of Patriarchs, a site holy to both Jews and Muslims. Goldstein killed 29 people in the Muslim section before he was stopped, and an angry crowd beat him to death. Tuesday, 4 days later, in the morning on March 1st, 1994, there was a shooting on the ramp of the Brooklyn Bridge. A van carrying 15 Orthodox Jewish yeshiva students dressed in recognizable Hasidic garb, was strafed with gunfire 3 times by a man driving a blue Chevy sedan. The lone gunman opened fire through his passenger window with 2 guns, a 9mm Cobra automatic machine gun and a 9mm Glock semi-automatic pistol. Witnesses said he yelled, "Kill all the Jews," in Arabic. 4 students were shot. One boy, with a bullet lodged in his head, sustained serious, lifelong injuries. Also shot in the head was 16-year-old Ari Halberstam, the oldest of his family's 5 children. He never regained consciousness and died 5 days later. By then, a man accused of the attack was in custody, a 28-year-old Lebanese-born livery cab driver living in Brooklyn named Rashid Baz. Why did he do it? Was it road rage, which police put forward as an early theory? Was this another tragic chapter in the endless eye for an eye pattern of Arab-Israeli violence? Was it revenge for the Hebron massacre? Was the attack on Ari Halberstam and his friends something larger, a coordinated act of terrorism? After the Brooklyn Bridge shootings, Hamas issued statements praising the attack and Baz. They called him a mujahideen, or holy warrior, and took great pride in what he did. Was that a clue? In December 1994, after a 5-week trial in New York State Court, a jury convicted Baz of 1 count of murder for killing Ari Halberstam and 14 counts of attempted murder for his gunshots at the other students in the van. Baz was sentenced to 141 years in state prison, where he resides today. As far as I know, no chance of parole. But the case is not closed, and it was not closed then. Halberstam's mother, Devorah, pushed for the murder to be declared officially an act of terrorism, which finally happened 6 years later. In 2000, the Department of Justice issued a report which said in part, the murder of Ari and the shooting at the van was motivated in significant part by Baz's views and his desire to retaliate against Jewish people. I can tell you in preparing for this conference, as I just said, the case is still not closed. The Ari Halberstam murder remains an open investigation by the Joint Terrorism Task Force here in New York. The JTTF wants to determine, finally, whether Baz really acted alone. Did he have collaborators or trainers or financial backers? Was Hamas or any other known group involved? These questions have never been fully answered. Just ask Devorah Halberstam. Remember the Meir Kahan murder. Unnoticed at first and for a long time, were El Sayed Nosair's connections to a widening circle of Islamic militants with America in its crosshairs. Only later would Nosair be linked to the group behind the first attack on the World Trade Center, the group that planned to attack New York area bridges and tunnels, as well as the United Nations and FBI buildings, and the group following the teachings of Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, the blind sheikh. Was something missed in the Rashid Baz case as well? That was kind of long, wasn't it?
It was good.
Karen's already introduced David, but he really is one of the nation's preeminent terrorism prosecutors, even though he's on hiatus from that mission. He was an assistant United States attorney, that's federal prosecutor. His office did not prosecute the Ari Halberstam case. He did that for 12 years. At one point was the head of the Terrorism and National Security Unit. In addition to the nation's only 9/11 case, which I watched David prosecute successfully in Virginia against Zacharias Moussaoui, he's worked on a lot of other al-Qaeda cases, the appeals in the embassy bombings case, for instance, which are still going on and trials are still going on for. He would have prosecuted, as Karen said, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the others charged and waiting in limbo in Guantanamo. And he's also prosecuted something we heard a lot about this morning, homegrown cases, such as 4 men who were convicted for plotting to bomb a couple of synagogues in the Bronx, known as the Newburgh Four. David left government 3 years ago and is now a partner, we have to plug your firm, a prestigious firm, Clifford Chance, here in Manhattan. So that's our introduction. The funny part about David and I doing this panel, even though we have some credibility in the terrorism circles, is I didn't cover the Halberstam trial, and he didn't prosecute it. But we have done our homework.
Indeed.
I hope. So let me start with that as a question, and I'll go through some questions that David and I have already gone over and prepared, and then we'll bring you all in and try to make this a discussion. So to be clear, the federal prosecutors, the U.S. Attorney's Office, this wasn't their case, right? Why was it a Manhattan District Attorney case?
Well, it was investigated and prosecuted as a murder case, and I don't think there was a whole lot of consideration to do it any other way at the start. As Phil has mentioned, as Karen mentioned, the case was subsequently looked at again by the federal law enforcement community, my former office, the local JTTF. But initially, it was mainly a state case, and not a whole lot of reason to pursue the case at the federal level, at least at the start.
Was the FBI not involved?
I don't think the FBI was involved substantially at the beginning. It was a very strong murder case, and was prosecuted as a murder case. I think the DA's office actually did very well to keep it as a murder case, because as a prosecutor, they had an open and shut. They had the shooter, they had witnesses. Why complicate it? The result was a conviction, a sentence for 141 years. From the state's perspective, that's a terrific result. I think what we're going to talk about here is what I think became apparent to the federal authorities as time went on, largely because of the pressure, I think is a nice way to put it, that the victim's family, and particularly Devorah Halberstam, put on the federal government to take a closer look, to re-examine things. But initially, the federal response was minimal.
So with the Manhattan DA in charge, state, local prosecutors in charge, they can only prosecute someone with the laws that they have. So was there a state terrorism charge that could have applied here, or even a federal terrorism charge that obviously on the surface could have applied here?
There was not a state terrorism charge, or at least not one that fit on the books back then. I think there's arguably one now. There have been federal terrorism laws on the books for a long time, since our embassies started getting attacked overseas, and certainly since 9/11, those laws have improved on the federal level. Not crystal clear whether even under today's laws, the shooting on the Brooklyn Bridge could have been prosecuted as a federal terrorism offense. Does that mean that the offense was not a terrorism offense? No, of course not. It was clearly terrorism motivated, and the FBI has since acknowledged it as such. But bottom line is the best fit in terms of charges for that case at that time, given the state of the investigation, was a murder charge, plain state murder.
I mean, in those days, my understanding was that a federal terrorism charge typically involves some kind of activity abroad. A clear exception would have been the 1993 first World Trade Center attack, but there were bombs used there, right? And a federal building, or a building that housed federal offices, was the target. The Brooklyn Bridge was not federal property. Isn't that also part of the calculus that might have gone on 20 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to. I don't necessarily think it got to that level of discussion back then. I think when my former office took a close look at the case in '99 and 2000, I think that's when things like this were considered and discussed. But there are sort of jurisdictional elements to federal crimes that distinguish it from sort of traditional murder in violation of state law, right? And so those distinguishing factors can have to do with the target, like a federal property, so embassies, office buildings that contain federal offices, like the World Trade Center at the time, or federal employees as victims. It can also be an overseas element, a connection to an overseas terrorist group, or even just a plot that has an overseas element to it. These are all things that distinguish a terrorism murder from a state court murder. Those considerations, I don't think were in play. A lot of those charges were available, but I don't think my office was engaged, and I don't think the FBI was engaged. I think everybody had deferred to the state system, which, I can't compliment those authorities enough, because they certainly did a wonderful job. But I think the question that remains about the case, and the one that I'm not sure we're ever going to have an answer to, is what could the JTTF or the FBI have found if it was investigating the case from the very beginning, as I believe it would today. Another thing that I think we'll talk about is a very different time back in 1994, and the way the FBI and the JTTF responds to incidents is very different today than it was back then. They always had great investigators. The apparatus, the system is different now.
It was only after the trial that the gunman, Boz, admitted his political motivation, I think, the revenge attack for Hebron. So how does that, without that evidence clearly in front of you, how would that hinder prosecutors, state or federal?
Well, it's tough. I mean, look, it didn't matter for the state. The motive, contrary to what we all see on television, motive is not an element of a state court murder trial. All you have to prove is that it was an intentional killing. Why somebody chose to shoot the gun is often proof of trial, but it's not a requirement. Similarly, on the federal level, if an event is motivated by terrorism or support for a terrorist organization, it may help you satisfy the elements of a terrorism crime, but not necessarily. You can have a crime that is motivated by, or inspired by ISIS or bin Laden or whomever, but you still have to meet some of those other jurisdictional elements to make it a federal offense. So I think the question in terms of whether the case could have been prosecuted separately probably hinges on something beyond the motive, whether it was admitted before or after the investigation, the trial.
Jim Comey this morning mentioned that he doesn't have time for turf battles. We all need to work together. But
Oh, really?
we know that they happen, and I'm just
I
wondering.
remember a few things.
That's another panel for another conference.
I worked for that guy.
But the truth is, we're live streaming. The truth is, New York State does now have a terrorism law. We've seen it a couple times in the post-9/11 world. I guess most recently was that Jose Pimentel case, a guy who has now pled guilty to planning to detonate some pipe bombs here in New York. But for the most part, the feds really take up a terrorism case when there is a terrorism case to be had. I mean, is there any possibility where federal authorities might have, I hate to use this word, Bigfoot, the state and local prosecutors here?
Yeah, I mean, that happens. I think Bigfoot is your words, not mine. My experience was always that the law enforcement community worked well together. There were definitely disputes over turf, but I wasn't involved in the investigation of this case, but I would be shocked to think that there was any sort of turf battle over the Halberstam investigation. I think it was decided back then that the cleaner, easier case was at the state level, and frankly, in those first days, the federal side was not treating it as a terrorism case, which is something that I am quite sure would not happen today.
Let me fill in a little factoid here about this incident and see how it affects the thinking. The reason the van was in Manhattan and going back to Brooklyn is Ari and his friends had been visiting the famous Hasidic Rabbi Menachem Schneerson, the Rebbe, as he was known. He was being treated in a Lower Manhattan hospital, and as I understand it, the boys had gone to visit him, and we're driving back, but Schneerson had some police protection. So he leaves and goes, I guess, down the West Side Highway into the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel entrance, and then that entrance gets blocked by the police escort. And so the van goes the other way that you go to the Brooklyn Bridge, and apparently Boz spots it, follows it, and then opens fire. If that theory were true or proven, would that lend itself in any way to a terrorism conspiracy, or can you have a conspiracy of one?
You can't have a conspiracy of one. I mean, it's very hard to sort of draw conclusions after the fact. But it does, it certainly suggests premeditation. But I think in my experience, and I think others who've investigated these kinds of things would agree, what might appear to be simple after the fact, sure, you get in a car, you follow around, is actually harder to pull off as a criminal act than you would expect. I mean, I had people tell me that 9/11 was simple. They just got on the planes with knives. Well, it wasn't. It was incredibly complicated. This is obviously something very different, but to follow somebody probably involves some surveillance ahead of time. Perhaps Boz was aware that the route might change or that the tunnel might be closed, and so maybe he had a plan B. It's hard to tell. I think the facts, if they suggest anything, probably suggest that there was some pre-planning, which could easily have involved others. I think, in retrospect, most people look at the facts and think it's kind of hard to imagine that this guy, a cab driver, would have ended up with three semi-automatic firearms and pull this off without any assistance whatsoever. And it's not to say that the people who did investigate this, and it was investigated at the state level, right from the shooting onward. It's not to say that those people haven't done a good job or covered all the leads. Where did the guns come from? Who did this guy hang out with? Who did he know? I mean, those things were investigated. But it would be interesting to see today's JTTF sort of go back in the time capsule and investigate this shooting the way they would investigate sort of anything like that today. As you all know, as I hope you know, there is not a single lead that the JTTF doesn't run to the ground today. I mean, I am talking anything and everything. My neighbor from Jordan across the street is making too much noise, and I think he's a terrorist. I mean, crazy, but they're going to go out and they're going to interview people. This is something that I think the JTTF would have been all over. I think it would have been investigating it probably in a different and more comprehensive way than it was investigated by local authorities at the time. And, we're not going to know for sure what would have happened. But the way the crime was committed and the fact that he had guns, there are other sort of loose ends that easily could have been exploited. May not know the answer.
Hamas praised the attack, but investigators never found evidence of backing beforehand, right? And then the guns, the two he used and the one that was in the trunk, investigators did determine, at least with the Glock, that he bought that from, I think, a known drug dealer who was selling a lot of guns bought in the South on the street here to criminally inclined people. But that doesn't make them collaborators in a terrorism act, even if they helped him do what he did.
No, it doesn't. But you don't just. I mean, how many of you would know how to go out and buy a Glock? Probably not many of you. I would hope. The FBI is here for anybody who raises their hand, by the way. Right. Well,
he means illegally, without a trace.
You probably are going to talk to somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. There's a chain, and again, who knows how many people were talked to, but I would suspect that if the JTTF were investigating today, there's not a person in Brooklyn who wouldn't have been spoken to about Rashid Baz and the guns and how they came about, and you never know what you're going to learn when you talk to everybody in town. The statement by Hamas is also significant. Obviously, it's significant when a foreign terrorist organization takes note of anything, but it is not common for that organization to praise acts really outside of that region. The fact that Hamas was paying attention to what was going on in the United States and in New York City, I think is very telling. Does it mean that Hamas funded the attack or helped plan the attack? No, but it does suggest that it does suggest that further investigation might have been warranted, both here and overseas. And look, I wasn't involved. I don't know how much was done, but it's certainly a fact that stands out to me as very significant, even looking back.
There were also two men, I should mention, who were convicted of minor charges of helping him also after the fact, who fixed up his car or helped him hide his car, but not members of a conspiracy as far as the authorities could tell. Eventually, though, the Justice Department did issue that report in 2000, reclassifying the case, and I think it's worth reading part of the definition of a terrorist act is simply an act of violence in furtherance of political or social objectives, and that seems to be what this really was in hindsight, right, David?
No question. I mean, the timing is of utmost significance. I mean, this was an attack that happened, sort of on the heels of the massacre in Hebron. It also, and again, this is all speculation, but there was a trial, there were two trials in the Southern District of New York, in Manhattan, federal court right next to the Brooklyn Bridge, of ultimately 6 different defendants who had participated in the first attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. The first of those 2 trials happened, started in late 1993 and finished with a conviction of 4 defendants 3 days after Ari Halberstam was killed. 3 days. So that means that sort of the height of that trial had occurred right around the time of the shooting, the summations, the most strenuous arguments. I don't know whether Rashid Baz was paying attention to that trial, but if he had, and if he had the thoughts that I know he is admitted to having, that trial certainly could have been an agitator. But did this fit the definition of terrorism? 100%, absolutely. The FBI and my former office have acknowledged that. There is an ongoing JTTF investigation. I think the question for me as a former prosecutor is, if it happened today, would we be able to fit that case in a federal criminal charge? Judging by the way, my former colleagues view these things, I'm sure they would figure out a way to do it. But I don't think there's any question that it meets the definition of terrorism on a federal level, and frankly should have been classified that from the beginning. And credit to the FBI for acknowledging that it is terrorism, even if it didn't do so right away.
We use that word terrorist a lot, not just in a legal sense. Certainly in the last month, the attack in Canada that was talked about this morning in Ottawa, quickly labeled a terrorist act. The NYPD, John Miller was here this morning talking to some of us privately about why he was quick to announce that Axe attack of recent weeks, why he considered him a terrorist based on some things their investigators have found in that person's background that showed an interest in an ideology, I guess is the best way to put it. Why is it important, and this may be my last question, we'll turn to the audience. David, you've dealt with a lot of victims' families. We've talked to Devorah Halberstam. You've dealt with 9/11 families. Why is it important to have, if you will, the right label on the criminal who commits an atrocity like this, the terrorist label, for instance?
Look, I think it's important sort of on a prosecutorial level. I mean, whether it's a label or not, you want to pursue all the charges that you can possibly pursue, even if it's in a state level and a federal level. We've had instances where, we've had essentially what we call backup federal charges. You never know what's going to happen at the state level. So, whether something is labeled terrorism or not, from a prosecutor's standpoint, you just want to bring all the charges you possibly can against somebody who you view as dangerous who has committed some type of atrocity. I think there is a symbolic element to this that I think rings particularly true for victims, or in this case, surviving victims of loved ones of the victim. It means everything because I think to the extent we ever can determine what the truth is, we do it through our justice system in cases like this. And the label becomes very important, the charge becomes very important, and obviously the conviction or acquittal very often becomes the only truth that we have. I think by pursuing this as a murder case, we satisfied sort of the prosecutorial interest and incapacitated a very, very dangerous person. But I'm not sure the trial alone spoke to the truth of the matter, and that's one of the reasons the FBI still has the case open. It's one of the reasons we have conferences like this, so we can look back and make some sense out of what we have in the record.
Anyone have any questions or comments? Yes, sir, right there.
Mr. Raskin, you mentioned the individual who was going out to buy the block and asking around. You mentioned the individual who was going.
It doesn't work, but you got to speak up.
Who was going around asking his friends where he could buy the block. I see an evolutionary pattern with the explosives. Immediately after 9/11, the people were going out, realizing they wanted to make a device, had absolutely no idea how to do it, so they asked around their friends until they ran into somebody who would drop a dime on them. There was an evolutionary step in the SUV in Times Square where the actor apparently paid more attention to the operational security aspects than on the EOD manufacture. It's evolved since then into magazines like Inspire and Leak. Do you think that the legal system is keeping up with those evolutionary steps?
Yeah, no, I mean, there are some fixes we can always make in the law, but I think the terrorism statutes have always been pretty good. I think these are hard investigations. I mean, you got to cover a lot of terrain, you got to talk to a lot of people, and particularly, I mean, the first scenario where you have people going around the neighborhood asking, how to build a bomb or guns, that's great. I mean, now all you got to do is go on the internet and not talk to anyone. So, the job the FBI and its counterparts do around the world, you have no idea how good they are, and they have to be, because it's very, very hard to investigate these things.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned that the investigation into Ari Halberstam's murder is ongoing, and then much more recently, about a year or so ago, we saw the arrest of Basil Ramadan in the Operation Tobacco Road tobacco trafficking ring, which was tied to known associates of them, and then various Commissioner Bratton and others made a big point of showing the close ties between these tobacco traffickers and the First World Trade Center bombing. Could you discuss some of that a little bit?
I'm just a corporate lawyer now. I don't. Look, I wish I knew what was going on. I miss it. We have time for a couple more?
Sure, sir.
Thank you very much for your presentations. Just to kind of update the record, there was evidence presented at the state trial of Rashid Baz attending a service and hearing a sermon calling on revenge for the Baruch Goldstein killing. So you were right to start with that. But I'm always struck by coincidence. And there are two nagging coincidences, at least. There are many more in this case. The first, both relate to the accessories after the fact. The first, one of the accessories was taking lessons as an airplane mechanic, both in Chicago and in Dallas-Fort Worth. Those are expensive. And
Absolutely.
the second was the fact that one of the other accessory after the fact was arrested, was brought into custody on a deportation order and held in Louisiana in immigration custody, and all of a sudden just summarily released, just goodbye. Eventually, INS caught up and asked for a $50,000 bail, which he paid. And then later, a few months later, he was picked up selling stolen goods, receiving stolen goods. And the Brooklyn DA asked for, I think, a $1,500 bail. How do you connect the dots? And what are we doing today that really helps us with those kind of problems?
No, well, look, I mean, we don't have insight into what is going on today to connect those particular dots. And even if we did, I'm sure we couldn't tell you. Not in this forum, at least. But I will say this. Look, cases, the FBI doesn't very often announce that they're categorizing something as a terrorism offense, right? It either is or it isn't from the beginning, and even if they made a mistake, they don't do this very often. Does that mean, it's a significant investigation? I don't know, but it means it's open and the FBI cared enough to make a statement about it. I think we share your curiosity with respect to those facts and others. My strong sense is that there are a lot of people at the FBI and other agencies who would have liked to have a shot at asking some of those questions back in 1994 and 95.
And I would say that, I was told by people who worked on this case, we could not connect any dots. Obviously, they were aware of the mosque. There were some radical statements were made, but you remember the Hebron massacre was a big global story. I mean, there were riots at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. There were protests by the thousands in Beirut. There were calls for revenge from Cairo. I mean, this was not a quiet event. And so there would have been a lot of ways for Baz, in my view, for him to get inspiration, if that's the right word, or the message to do something in retaliation. Hamas, we have seen over the years a handful of federal and other prosecutions in New York and other states for things like cigarette smuggling and so forth. And those things have obviously been mentioned in connection to in this case as well, but I guess they haven't been able to prove it, and so you're left with this, as Jim Comey would say, perhaps a lone rat, until they find people who actually, collaborated with him. We have time maybe for one more quick question. Yes, ma'am.
In 1993, with the first World Trade Center incident, in the basement with the vans or whatever, the explosives, we knew of that case. And then in 1994, when the shooter was on the bridge, he was also in, I believe, an SUV, and I don't know the car, but anyway, did they ever check to see whether that particular car was ever down in that area where they had the bombs? And also, was he ever investigated as to being connected with the blind sheik in the mosque in Brooklyn earlier? Was he, an ongoing suspect?
I'm quite sure he was investigated. I think the question is how extensive
link?
was the investigation? I mean, there's no question. There's an obvious potential connection. It's Brooklyn. It's radical.
Okay. And was Lynn Stewart who was the lawyer for the shooter
It
wasn't
at
her.
that time?
It was not her.
It wasn't.
It wasn't.
But as we mentioned, the trial for the first World Trade Attack was simultaneous with the shooting, but they found no connections between the first World Trade Center conspiracy and this attack on the Brooklyn Bridge. I guess we're out of time. Thank you, David. Thank you, Karen. And thank you all for staying.